The morning Harold Brennan walked into the Colladine County implement dealership, nobody there thought he was about to make the most important decision of his life. To them, he was just another dusty farmer passing through on a Saturday, the kind who came in to look and left with nothing. It was August of 1967, the kind of Kansas summer where the heat didn't just sit on your skin, but pressed down on your shoulders, where the wind carried more dust than relief, and the ground had started to crack open in long pale seams. Harold had driven 17 miles from his place outside Meridian in a battered 1959 Chevy pickup. The paint sunburned thin, the bench seats split into places and held together with duct tape. He parked at the far end of the lot, not because he was being polite, but because he didn't want anyone thinking he believed he belonged right up front. When he stepped through the glass doors, the cool air hit him hard, and so did the smell of new paint, rubber, and money. The showroom floor was clean enough to eat off, bright under fluorescent lights, lined with tractors that looked more like promises than machines. Green and yellow paint so fresh it almost hurt your eyes. John Deere 4020 stood there like monuments, polished and perfect, the future of farming according to every brochure and salesman within 100 miles. Harold stopped just inside the door and took his hat off, out of habit more than respect. He was 32 years old that summer, lean and weathered, his hands thick with callus and oil that no amount of scrubbing ever fully removed. His boots were scuffed and cracked, his denim faded nearly white at the knees, and he smelled faintly of dust and diesel no matter how clean his shirt was when he put it on. He didn't wander right up to the tractors. He walked slow, reading placards, keeping his hands in his pockets, doing the math in his head the way farmers always do whether they want to or not. 95 horsepower, power steering, hydraulic remotes, 8-speed transmission. He knew what all of it meant. He also knew what it cost. For $1,800, give or take, depending on how generous the man selling it felt. Like being, that number sat in his chest like a stone. It was more money than he had ever held at one time. More money than he could imagine owing without it changing the way he slept at night. Harold farmed for 120 acres. His grandfather had broken with mules back when Blackjack Creek still flooded every spring, and the cottonwoods were thick enough to shade a man at noon. He grew wheat mostly, some milo when the year called for it, kept a small herd of cows more out of habit than profit, and he did it all with equipment most of the county had already traded away or left to rust behind barns. His main tractor was a 1949 Farmall M, the red paint faded to a chalky pink in places, the serial plate worn smooth from decades of vibration and weather. His father had bought it used in 1953, and Harold had learned to drive it standing between his father's knees, his hands barely able to reach the wheel. That tractor had plowed every acre of the Brennan place for nearly 20 years, pulled every wagon, powered every belt, and Harold knew it the way some men knew their own heartbeat. He knew how much choke it needed on cold mornings, which cylinder liked to miss when the timing drifted, how the clutch felt just before it started to slip. But standing there in that showroom, looking at machines that gleamed like they had never known a hard day, Harold felt something he didn't like admitting, even to himself. He felt small. He felt old. He felt like the world had started moving faster than he could keep up with. A man named Vernon Pitts noticed him eventually. Vernon was the kind of salesman who wore a tie even when it was 100 degrees outside. His hair slicked back and not a strand out of place. He had the easy confidence of someone who believed the world worked exactly the way it should. For people like him, Vernon took one look at Harold's boots and hands and made a decision before a single word was spoken. He let Harold stand there a while longer, then wandered over with his hands in his pockets and a smile that never quite reached his eyes. "Can I help you with something?" he asked. The words polite enough but flat. Harold nodded toward the nearest for 1,020. "I was wondering what you're asking for one of those." Vernon's smile widened just enough to show teeth. "That's a serious machine," he said. 95 horsepower, power steering. You can cover twice the ground in half the time. That's the future of farming right there." He named the price like it was nothing, like men didn't lose sleep over numbers like that. Harold listened, nodded once, and then asked the question he already knew the answer to. "What would you give me on trade for my Farmall?" The air in the showroom shifted. Vernon's expression hardened, just a touch. "Which Farmall?" 49M, Harold said. "Runs good. New clutch last spring. Rebuilt the carburetor myself a couple years back." Vernon laughed, short and sharp, the kind of laugh meant to be heard. "A 49M, he said. "Hell, friend, that thing's old enough to vote. I couldn't give you more than 100 for it. And that's only if I'm feeling generous. Probably end up scrapping it for parts." Two other men browsing nearby had stopped pretending not to listen. Harold could feel their eyes on him, feel the judgment settle in the silence. 200, Harold repeated, not asking, just letting the number hang there. "That's charity." Vernon said, warming to it now. "Nobody wants those old M's anymore. They're slow, they're small, they're obsolete. You're probably burning more money keeping that thing alive than it's worth. Smart farmers are upgrading. That's how they stay profitable. Guys still running that old international junk." Well, he shrugged and let the sentence die where it stood. Someone chuckled. Harold felt the heat rise in his chest, but his voice stayed level. "That tractor's pulled every pound of wheat I've grown for 14 years. And that's exactly my point," Vernon said, leaning against the big rear tire like he owned it. "You're working twice as hard to grow half as much. This machine would change that. But hey, if you want to keep nursing a relic along, that's your business. Just don't come crying when you can't compete anymore." Harold stood there another moment, looking at the 4020, doing the math one last time even though he knew it wouldn't change. Then he nodded once, turned, and walked out into the heat without another word. The drive home felt longer than 17 miles. The fields along the road looked tired, the wheat already cut short in places where the drought had taken its share. Harold kept his eyes on the road, hands steady on the wheel, replaying the showroom over and over, every word, every laugh. Sarah met him at the kitchen door when he got home and knew before he said a thing. She had been a farm wife long enough to read disappointment in the way a man set his hat down. "They wouldn't work with you," she said, pouring him coffee, even though the house was already hot. "Offered me 100 for the M," Harold said. "Called it charity." Sarah set the cup down harder than she meant to. $200 for a tractor that works every day, she said. "They said smart farmers are upgrading." Sarah didn't raise her voice. She didn't have to. "Smart farmers are also losing their farms," she said quietly. "The Hendricks place went under last month. Bill Morehouse lost his land in July. Both of them bought new equipment 3 years ago." Harold wrapped his hands around the cup and stared at the table. "Vernon Pitts basically called me a fool in front of half the county," he said. "Said I'm working twice as hard to grow half as much." Sarah reached across and took his hand. "Are you?" she asked. Harold thought about it. "Probably," he said. "But I know that tractor. I know what I can fix on it. And I don't owe anybody a dime for it." Sarah nodded once. "Then we keep the Farmall," she said, "and Vernon Pitts can go straight to hell." Something settled in Harold's chest then, like a decision finally clicking into place. Keeping the Farmall wasn't just stubbornness. It meant choosing a harder road that nobody else could see. It meant becoming the kind of farmer people laughed at and then forgot about. It meant learning things other men were already paying someone else to do. That fall, while other farmers talked about new purchases and financing terms, Harold sat at the kitchen table with borrowed manuals spread out, teaching himself diesel theory and hydraulics by lamplight. He practiced welding on scrap until his beads held under load. He started haunting salvage yards and auctions, building a pile of parts in the corner of the barn that other men would have called junk. The Farmall became more than a machine. It became proof of something he couldn't quite explain, something about not letting other people decide what kind of farmer he was allowed to be. Word spread the way it always does in places like Meridian. Harold Brennan was still running that old Farmall, still doing things the hard way, still refusing to modernize. Some men respected it. Most didn't. At the feed store and the grain elevator, conversations stopped when he walked up. Vernon Pitts made sure the story stayed alive. Told it like a joke about the stubborn fool who wouldn't step into the future. It got laughs. It got nods. And the years started to turn, slow and heavy, one after another, and nobody yet knew who time was really going to side with. The years after that decision did not come with any kind of reward at first. There was no quiet satisfaction waiting just around the corner. No moment where Harold could say he'd chosen right and feel it settle in his bones. What came instead were seasons that tested him in ways nobody in that showroom would ever see. The winter of 1967 bled into 1968 with little snow and less moisture. And when spring finally came, the wheat came up uneven, thin in the low spots, pale on the ridges where the soil had already given up what little it had left. Harold worked longer hours than most men he knew, not because he wanted to prove anything, but because that was the only way the numbers even pretended to make sense. He drove the Farmall from first light until the sky went soft at dusk, listening to the engine the way a doctor listens to a heartbeat, alert for any change in pitch or rhythm. When something rattled loose or started to whine, he fixed it himself that night, under a single bulb in the barn, fingers numb in the cold, grease ground into his skin. There were evenings he came into the house so tired he barely spoke, just washed up, ate whatever Sarah had kept warm on the stove, and fell asleep in the chair with his boots still on. Sarah never complained. She watched the ledger as closely as he did, penciling figures, erasing them, moving small amounts from one column to another, trying to make room for the unexpected. In town, the talk was all about upgrades, new planters, bigger combines, better yields. Men talked about payments the way they talked about weather. Something uncomfortable but unavoidable. Vernon Pitts kept selling tractors, one after another. The lot outside the dealership changing every few weeks as shiny machines rolled out, and older ones came back in on trade. Every time Harold passed through Coladine, Vernon smiled that same knowing smile, the one that said he was waiting. In 1968 the rain finally came, hard and sudden, turning the fields green almost overnight. Blackjack Creek ran bank to bank for the first time in years, and for a while it felt like the land itself had decided to give Harold a break. The wheat came in strong enough to matter, not enough to make him comfortable, but enough to pay down a little on the land note and fix the barn roof. That had leaked since his father's time. The Farmall never missed a beat, pulling the drill, hauling wagons, doing exactly what it had always done. That winter, Harold tore into the transmission, replacing worn gears and bearings one piece at a time, learning as he went, laying parts out on clean rags so he wouldn't forget how they went back together. He worked slow, careful, because mistakes cost money he didn't have. In 1969, the freeze came late and cruel, burning the early wheat down to the ground. Then the grasshoppers arrived, clouds thick enough to darken the sun, chewing through anything green they could find. Harold replanted where he could, switched acres to Milo, did what he had to do just to break even. Round him, other farmers talked about calling their dealers, about needing more horsepower to get across fields faster, about financing options that sounded good until you wrote them down. 2 farms outside Meridian went under that year. Families packed up quietly, their houses sitting empty with curtains still hanging in the windows. No one talked much about it. You just noticed the silence where there used to be lights at night. In 1970, the drought came back, harder than before. The ground cracked open, the sky stayed pale and empty, and Blackjack Creek shrank to a trickle you could step across without getting your boots wet. Harold changed the way he worked his fields, left more stubble than his neighbors thought made sense, tried to hold what little moisture there was. His yields weren't good, but they were better than some, and that mattered more than pride. That winter he rebuilt the hydraulic pump, piece by piece, hands stiff from cold, breath fogging in the barn. He learned to diagnose problems by sound, by feel, by instinct, skills that weren't written down anywhere. In town, Vernon Pitts was still selling futures, bigger machines, more acres, more efficiency. Men who had once joked about Harold's Farmall now nodded politely and went on about their own plans. By 1971, 3 more farms around Meridian had been sold off. By 1972, it was 7. Good men, hard workers, the kind who did everything right, according to the experts, bought the right equipment, expanded at the right time, and still lost when the bank came calling. Their tractors went at auction for pennies on the dollar. Their land got absorbed into larger operations or sold to investors who never walked it. The mercantile closed. The grain elevator started talking about consolidation. The county fair felt smaller every year. Harold kept farming his 420 acres, kept fixing what broke, kept his head down. There were nights he lay awake listening to the wind and wondering if he was wrong, if stubbornness would eventually cost him everything. Sarah never said it out loud, but she wondered too. Then in the fall of 1973, everything shifted in a way nobody in Coincidental County had planned for. The oil embargo hit, and diesel prices jumped so fast it made men dizzy. The big new tractors that had looked so impressive in the showroom suddenly drank fuel. That cost twice, then 3 times what it had a year before. Budgets fell apart overnight. Farmers who had planned on cheap diesel found themselves scrambling just to cover their acres. Without bleeding cash, Harold's Farmall, with its smaller engine and simpler design, sipped fuel by comparison. What had been called a weakness became an advantage. He could still work his fields, still get his crops in, and he was spending a fraction of what his neighbors were just to keep moving. One Saturday morning that winter, a man named Ray Thornton pulled into Harold's yard in a new GMC pickup. Ray ran a big operation on the north end of the county and had been in the showroom that day in 1967. He'd left then. Now he stood in the cold, hands shoved in his pockets, looking at the Farmall through the open barn door. "I'm selling. Out," he said finally. "Can't make the numbers work anymore." He paused, swallowed. "I remember what Vernon said to you. Thought you'd be done in 2 years." He looked around, at the fields still being worked, at the barn still standing. "Guess you were the smart one." Harold didn't say much. There wasn't anything to say. After Ray left, Harold went back to work, but his hands shook slightly. And it wasn't from the cold. The years kept turning. Fuel stayed high. Prices bounced. Rain came or didn't. Harold rebuilt the Farmall's engine in the winter of 1976, boring the cylinders, installing new pistons and rings, replacing everything that wore or sealed. It took him 3 months, working nights and weekends, taking pictures as he went so he'd remember how it all fit back together. When he fired it up in the spring, it ran smoother than it had in decades, and Harold stood there listening to it idle, feeling something close to gratitude. By then, more houses sat empty, more barns went quiet. The community felt thinner, stretched, but Harold's farm endured, one careful repair, one hard season at a time. And somewhere beneath the exhaustion, there was a sense that time itself was starting to lean his way, even if it wasn't ready to say so out loud yet. By the time 1977 started to show itself on the calendar, Harold Brennan had already lived through enough seasons to know better than to trust good news. When it came too easy, he had learned that survival didn't announce itself with headlines or sudden turns of fortune. It showed up quietly, one paid bill at a time, one machine that still ran when it shouldn't, one neighbor who didn't show up at church anymore because they'd already left town. The winter of 1976 had been spent almost entirely in the barn. The Farmall stripped down to its bones, parts laid out on wooden benches like a puzzle only Harold could solve. He worked slow and deliberate, measuring twice, cleaning everything until it shone, replacing what was worn and trusting his hands on the rest. There were nights when the barn radio crackled low in the background, news about fuel prices and markets and things happening far away that still reached into Blackjack Creek and wrapped themselves around men like him. When he finally turned the key that spring and the engine caught, running smoother than it had in 20 years, Harold didn't smile. He just stood there listening, hands on his hips, feeling the steady rhythm settle into his chest. Outside the barn, the county felt different than it had a decade earlier. Fields that used to belong to families now belonged to companies. Houses sat empty long enough for weeds to climb their porches. The old mercantile in Meridian closed its doors for good. The windows papered over within a week. The grain elevator merged with another 2 counties over, and suddenly hauling grain meant driving farther, burning more fuel, spending more time on the road. Men talked less at the feed store. When they did, it was about who was next. who was holding on by their fingernails, who had just gotten a letter from the bank. Harold kept his head down and his schedule tight. He planted when the soil was ready, not when the calendar said he should. He worked his ground the way he'd learned through trial and error, leaving enough residue to hold moisture, trusting methods nobody wrote articles about anymore. The oil embargo had changed the math in ways Vernon Pitts never mentioned back. When he was selling the future from behind a desk, big tractors burned money every hour they ran. Harold's Farmall didn't. That difference didn't make headlines, but it kept his operation breathing. In town, the smiles Harold used to get were gone. People didn't laugh anymore. They watched, some with curiosity, some with resentment, some with something like respect they weren't ready to admit out loud. One afternoon that summer, Harold stopped at the elevator and ran into a man he hadn't seen in years, a farmer who used to joke loudest about old equipment. The man shifted his weight, stared at the ground, then finally said it. "You know, I should have listened. It wasn't an apology. It didn't need to be." That was the moment Harold understood something important. He hadn't outsmarted anyone. He just stayed when others couldn't. That fall, he made the final payment on the land note. The check wasn't large, but it felt heavier than any he'd ever written. When the clerk at Meridian Bank stamped the paperwork and slid it back across the counter, Harold held it a second longer than necessary, like he was making sure it was real. He walked out into the street with that folded paper in his pocket, the sun low over the courthouse, and felt something ease inside him that had been tight for a very long time. He was 42 years old. Every acre he worked belonged to him. Now, Sarah threw a small gathering that evening. Nothing fancy. A few neighbors who were still around, people who understood what it meant just to still be there. They grilled steaks in the yard, drank beer as the light faded, told stories about close calls and years they thought they wouldn't make it. Someone asked Harold how he'd managed when so many others hadn't. He thought about it longer than people expected. "I didn't try to be bigger than I was," he said finally. "Didn't try to beat anybody at their own game. Just ran what I could afford. Fixed what I could fix." Sarah snorted from across the yard. "And he's stubborn," she said. Harold nodded. That too. A few weeks later, Harold drove into Coladine on a Friday afternoon and saw the signs. On the implement dealership for the first time. Bankruptcy sale. Inventory liquidated. Franchise terminated. The lot where the John Deeres used to shine sat empty. Bare concrete baking in the sun. Harold parked his truck and sat there for a minute, hands on the wheel, remembering the smell of that showroom, the laughter, the way he'd walked out without saying a word. He didn't feel victorious. He felt tired. He felt sad for what the town had lost along the way. A car pulled up beside him. A Cadillac that looked out of place even then. Vernon Pitts sat behind the wheel, his hair still slicked back, his tie loosened. For a moment their eyes met through the glass. Harold saw something he'd never seen on Vernon's face before. Not anger, not arrogance, just a hollow look, the kind that comes when a man realizes he was loudly wrong about something that mattered. Harold nodded once, not in triumph, not in forgiveness, just acknowledgement. Vernon nodded back, then drove away. That was the last time Harold ever saw him. The years after were steadier, not easy, but steady. Harold kept farming the same land, kept the same equipment running, helped neighbors when he could, asked little. In return, young men started coming by with questions about old machines they'd bought cheap, about problems mechanics charged too much to fix. Harold showed them what he knew, not because he thought the old ways would come back, but because knowledge was something you lost if you didn't pass it on. By the time the decade closed, Blackjack Creek still ran when it rained. The Farmall still started when Harold turned the key, and the Brennan place was still there. Quiet proof that sometimes surviving wasn't about being ahead of your time, but about refusing to let time push you out of the way. The years after 1977 did not come with any grand turning point, and that was exactly the point. What changed was not Harold Brennan's life so much as the way time finally stopped pressing so hard against it. With the land paid for and the bank no longer holding its breath over his shoulder, the days settled into a rhythm that felt earned rather than borrowed. He still rose before the sun, still drank his coffee standing at the counter while Sarah packed his lunch, still walked out to the barn listening to the quiet before the engine started. The Farmall waited where it always had, its paint thinner now than ever, its metal softened by decades of heat and cold. But when Harold turned the key, it answered the same way it always had, steady and familiar, a sound that meant work could begin. Round him, the county continued to thin. Another church closed its doors when there were no longer enough families to justify the heat in winter. The school district consolidated again. Buses driving farther down gravel roads that used to lead to houses now standing empty. Fields that once had names attached to them were referred to by acreage alone, managed by people who came and went, without ever learning the way the land shifted after rain. Harold noticed these things the way you notice scars on a body you've lived in long enough to recognize every change. He didn't comment much on them. He just kept doing what he had always done. In the early 80s, he rebuilt the Farmall's transmission again, replacing what finally wore out after more hours than anyone had expected it to last. In 1983, he swapped out the radiator, and in 1986, he put in another clutch. Each repair came easier than the last, not because the work was simpler, but because Harold had learned how to listen, how to feel when something was off before it failed. Other farmers began stopping by more often, sometimes sheepish, sometimes direct, asking questions about machines they'd bought cheap at auctions when new ones were out of reach. Harold showed them what he knew, handed them tools, let them make mistakes under his watch so they wouldn't have to make them alone later. He never charged much. Sometimes he took cash, sometimes a six-pack, sometimes nothing at all. It wasn't about money anymore. It was about keeping something from disappearing completely. On quiet evenings, Harold and Sarah would sit on the porch and watch the light fall across the fields, the land taking on that familiar gold and purple that had meant the end of workdays. For generations before them, they talked about the kids, both grown now, both having gone to college, something that would have been hard to imagine back when every dollar felt borrowed from the future. They talked about neighbors who were gone, about farms that had been broken up and sold off piece by piece, about how strange it felt to still be there when so many weren't. There was no celebration in it, just a shared understanding that survival carried its own weight. Once, years later, Harold drove past the old implement dealership site again. A different business sat there now, the concrete lot cracked and patched, the memory of shiny tractors reduced to a shape in the back of his mind. He didn't slow down. There was nothing left to see. Vernon Pitts, he heard, had moved to Wichita, selling insurance or something close to it. A job that still required confidence and a clean tie, but no longer came with a showroom full of promises. Harold never spoke his name out loud again. He didn't need to. The proof of what mattered sat in his fields, in the barn, in the quiet continuity of days that didn't depend on anyone else's approval. The Farmall kept working. The land kept producing enough. Life stayed small and manageable, which Harold had learned was the only kind that didn't eventually ask for more than it gave back. When younger men asked him why he'd never upgraded, never expanded, never tried to turn 420 acres into something bigger, he shrugged and said the same thing every time. I ran what I could fix, he told them. I lived on what I could afford. He didn't dress it up. He didn't frame it as wisdom. It was just the truth as he had learned it, hammered into him year by year while other people chased something louder. The Farmall outlived every prediction made about it. It outlasted trends, interest rates, and more than a few men who had sworn they were too smart to fail. Harold knew one day it would finally quit for good, metal giving up after everything it had been asked to carry. When that day came, he figured he'd know what to do. Until then, it stayed where it belonged, not as a symbol, not as a statement, but as a tool that had earned its place by showing up every morning when it was needed. Harold Brennan never became famous. He never expanded his operation beyond what his hands and his time could manage. He didn't write books or give speeches or get held up as an example while he was still alive. What he did instead was remain. He stayed when staying became unfashionable. He worked when others were told to scale or disappear. He listened when the world got louder and louder about what success was supposed to look like and chose not to answer back. Years later, people still talked about him, usually quietly. Usually when the subject of debt or machines or hard times came up, someone would say his name and nod, and that would be the end of it. The Farmall would still be there in their minds, pulling another load, doing another day's work. Not because it was special, but because it had been understood. And for the people who watched this story unfold from the outside, or recognized it because they had lived something close to it themselves, that was the part that stayed with them. Not the moment in the showroom, not the man who laughed, but the long stretch in between, where nothing dramatic happened and everything important did, where a quiet decision made under pressure carried a family, a piece of land, and a way of life through years that erased so much else.